Welcome to the next installment of Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. I think of animals as agents. I apply the ideas of agent-based modeling that I learned in the Russell and Norvig AI book. Any animal, any insect, it's an agent. It gets observations from the environment through its senses. Those observations can be imperfect. They use those observations to update some internal state. That updated state informs what decision they want to make, what action to select. After choosing their action, they execute that action, often also imperfectly. They execute it against the environment. In the case of animals, the real world. This model of an agent is rather complete, but really does sweep that notion of the decision under the rug. How does the agent make the decision? Do they blindly follow some equilibria computed by the techniques of game theory? Do they follow a more decision-theoretic path, using Bayesian theory and utility theory to estimate the likelihood of future states, evaluate the quality of being in those states, and pursuing the action which maximizes expected utility? You're telling me a little tardigrade does all that? Well, whether or not bumblebees and neotropic bats are following algorithms, whether or not they have Confucius-like deliberation about the future in order to select the optimal right action to take to advance themselves or their team, whatever they're doing, decisions must be nonetheless made. While we might not be able to measure the internal state of those agents, scientists can observe how their decision changes under different constraints. What's the behavior at temperature X versus temperature Y? What happens when food is scarce or plentiful? And with the right set of observations, perhaps that agent function can be learned. What is the mapping from the current state, the conditions under which the agent lives, its own internal thoughts, and what action it takes?
Hi, my name is Claire Hemmingway. I am an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I'm within the departments of psychology and ecology and evolutionary biology.
And can you share a little background on the types of things you're interested in researching?
Yeah, so I'm generally interested in animal cognition, but within animal cognition, which is a really broad field, I'm very interested in decision making and how animals make decisions, especially in unfriendly choice environments when they have too many options to contend with, and those options can vary in several important ways, and they're trying to maximize whatever decision that they're making in those settings.
So if we were to talk about something like a chess playing algorithm, the decision is what piece to move and where to put it. How do you have a sense of, an animal's decision when you can't really do an MRI and know what they're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a black box of we know what they're able to perceive in their environment, generally speaking, and we can measure the behavioral output. What's actually happening in the process is sort of what I'm interested in, not necessarily at a neural level, but generally sort of the different strategies they use to contend with these different environments and the choices within them. But yeah, most of what I measure is sort of the behavioral output. And so if I manipulate the choice environments in certain key ways and measure their decisions, that gives me some indication of what they're attending to and how much emphasis they're sort of placing on it.
And are there any particular species you're especially interested in?
I am interested in quite a few species, but my expertise and background come from neotropical bats in Panama and bumblebees currently, which is what I studied for my postdoc, and I'm continuing to study as I get my lab set up here at the University of Tennessee.
Could you maybe contrast those, bees and bats? Like, are there different behaviors or different things you can study in each?
Yeah, totally. So a lot of the questions that I'm interested in sort of bridge both systems nicely. I'm really interested in foraging decisions primarily, although I could certainly see myself working in other contexts. Both bees and bats, well, the bats that I study, I should say, I have done work on frog-eating bats primarily. That was the sort of central system I worked on for my PhD. But I also worked on fruit-eating bats, Jamaican fruit bats in the neotropics, both of which are very much generalist foragers. And so they're eating a lot of different things. So for frog-eating bats, they're eating a lot of different frog species, but they're also eating a bunch of different insect species. Fruit-eating bats are the Jamaican fruit-eating bats, I should say, are fig specialists, but they're fruit generalists, so they eat over 100 different types of tropical fruit. Bumblebees similarly are floral generalists, so they're collecting nectar and pollen from quite a few different flower species. And so in these cases where animals are having to choose between a lot of different types of options, and we know some things about the properties of those options that they're attending to, I'm really curious how they make decisions and which options they choose and in which contexts.
And you'd mentioned foraging decisions, and a few, I think, examples there, but what is the, breadth of decisions one makes when foraging?
You could sort of answer that at multiple different levels. We could think about this from a generalist versus a specialist. So how many types of things are they including in their diet, sort of at an evolutionary scale, but just a smaller scale in their daily decisions, how many different types of things they're out of the total number of things that they're able to eat and know about in their environment, how many are they choosing to include in their diet and which options among those are being chosen. That varies seasonally for the bats. We know that their diet is changing dramatically across the course of their season and with their own changes in energetic sort of requirements across the course of the season. But for bees specifically, that happens on a much shorter time scale, and they exhibit crazy behaviors like floral constancy, where they specialize for short periods of time on certain flower types.
It seems natural that a lot of those choices would be motivated by like survival and things like that. Is there any, like, I don't know if you could call it a personal preference to it, but I don't want to eat the same thing every day.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we know that especially for generalist species, in order to meet all of their energy requirements and balance all of the sort of macro and micronutrients that they need, that they have to sort of diversify their diet and eat a whole suite of different things. And that sort of works in terms of the things that are benefiting you, but also the things that are, maybe potentially toxic. So for bees that are eating nectar and pollen, we know that nectar can have a whole suite of sort of secondary compounds, some of which can be mildly toxic. And so perhaps eating too much of the same thing could be detrimental in those contexts.
Do they communicate with each other, like if they found an especially good patch or something like that?
So bumblebees kind of is the answer, and I'm sure some people could speak more to this than me, but honeybees have the really sophisticated waggle dance where they come back to the nest and they can give exact location and quality information to conspecifics within the hive that, sends foragers out directly to that quality food patch. Bumblebees, when they encounter a really attractive food source, will come back to the nest and they'll be really excited. They'll vibrate their body vigorously across the nest, and they'll do it for a couple of minutes. And depending on conspecifics attending to those potential cues and I think the current reserves of the colony, that could initiate more foragers to go out and in search of those food reserves. They also attend, I think, more so in bumblebees and honeybees, to social information outside of the nest. So they'll attend to other bumblebees on specific flower types, as well as scent cues on certain flowers that have been recently visited by other bumblebees.
And when you consider like designing an experiment, I'm curious what some of the variables and controls are that you look at.
A lot of the experiments that I've done so far with bumblebees have involved manipulating properties of the rewards themselves, and to some degree, the signals that are associated with those rewards, so the floral signals like colors and scents. Nectar is this really complex reward. It varies on several different reward dimensions. It can vary in volume. It can vary in sucrose concentration, reward rate, like I mentioned, secondary compounds and potentially olfactory cues. And so I'm really careful to keep consistent the things that I'm not directly manipulating in order to actually figure out how bees are assessing those properties of the nectar rewards. And then obviously keep the floral signals constant if I am just looking at how they're responding to the rewards, and manipulate the signals accordingly if I'm looking at how they form expectations or learn about those signals that are paired with certain reward options.
And do you need to study them in the wild, or could you bring them into a lab and do a very, very controlled test?
Both. So a lot of what I've done so far and a lot of what I will continue to do is in the lab. There are so many factors that we can control for in the ways that we can't in the field. So we can hook up a single colony to a foraging arena. We can let out a single forager at a time that's marked. And so we can measure individual preferences. We can also measure colony level preferences. We can control for the use of social information within the colony, and control for all of the stimuli and the rewards that we're manipulating directly and measuring their responses to. I mean, obviously that's very attractive for so many reasons. And, for the types of experiments that I'm interested in doing, that level of control is sort of necessary to answer some questions that I have. But I'm really interested in then taking some of those questions and addressing whether they actually play out in natural systems when there are a lot of other factors that are sort of out of our control at play. I've done a recent experiment where we followed up on some work that we did in the lab, exploring incentive contrast effects, and found pretty robust contrast effects that were mediated by expectations with floral stimuli, and found similar patterns out in the field when we measured them on wild bumblebees foraging from actual wildflowers.
Very neat. A good finding then, so that your lab results will generalize, I guess.
Totally. I mean, there were some interesting differences, and I think that too is interesting. Comparing what we're seeing in the lab versus what we're seeing in the field gives us some indication of what else is being factored into the decision-making processes for these animals.
Could you share a little bit about those differences?
The main difference that we found is that when we work with these bees in the lab, they're kind of spoiled. We feed them really well. They have like constant access to high quality sucrose most of the time, which is not necessarily the case for bees in the wild, at least most bees. I think I might need to explain the experiment first and then.
Sure, yeah.
So incentive contrast effects, they relate to how animals respond to certain stimuli based on their recent experience with similar types of rewards. And so if you give a bee 50% sucrose, they're really happy. If you then give them 30% sucrose, we generally see that they'll reject that, especially in the lab. If you just gave them 30% the entire time, they would accept that readily, continuously. And then if you started them on 10% and gave them 30%, they'd be really excited about that 30%. And so 30% is not 30%. It's based on your recent experience, especially with similar reward types. And so we found the same types of patterns playing out in natural systems, although that sort of threshold of acceptability was much lower in the field than what it was in the lab. And that sort of makes sense because they are not being fed 30% sucrose constantly in the wild. And so they're probably way more excited to have anything that's sort of acceptable.
Well, when I think about my own eating habits, they're driven by variety for sure, cost as well, taste definitely, and last, even though it should be first, how many calories are in it. What are some of the driving factors that make an animal choose what different foraging option to pick? Recently, the world learned of the power of artificial intelligence, a technology cybersecurity leaders have been leveraging for years. Now, as AI expands and evolves, those same security leaders are left wondering where humans fit into the next generation of AI-empowered security tools and solutions. Arctic Wolf, the industry leader in managing security operations, seeks to understand this question in the newly published report, The Human-AI Partnership. Access the insights of over 800 cybersecurity decision-makers in North America and the United Kingdom, to better understand how organizations are weighing the benefits and risks of deploying AI tools. Uncover the biggest obstacles to turning AI and human engineers into a formidable team. Discover why the near-term benefits of large language models are being upended by a crucial flaw in the technology. And learn what the risks of AI tools mean for human practitioners moving forward. Get your copy of this report today at arcticwolf.com/dataskeptic. That's Arctic, ARCTIC, Wolf, WOLF.com/dataskeptic, all one word. arcticwolf.com/dataskeptic. What are some of the driving factors that make an animal choose what different foraging option to pick?
So this ties into optimal foraging theory, and certainly calories are, while that may be on the low end of your list, that certainly is on the high end of most animals' lists in terms of things that they're trying to maximize when they're making foraging decisions. The other things that we know based on sort of optimal foraging theory is, the time and time necessary to sort of find and handle the things that they're trying to eat. And then, balancing their nutritional requirements. And so making sure that they're hitting all of those sort of target requirements with the things that they're incorporating within their diet.
Could you give me a rough definition of optimal foraging theory?
Yeah, optimal foraging theory is a set of sort of optimality models that were developed, I think, in the 1970s, maybe a little bit before then. It's basically a set of rules that explain when animals should include certain things within their diet based on the energy that they're going to obtain from that food resource, the search time that goes into finding it, and then the handling time that goes into actually being able to eat it. The sort of guiding principle of optimal foraging theory is that animals are trying to maximize this currency, which is basically the net energy per unit time spent foraging. And it's this very predictive set of models that allow us to actually gauge whether animals will actually include certain things within their diet or not. So they're very predictive in a lot of contexts.
And you described them a little bit as rules. Could we break them down, maybe not, in audio format, but are there actual formulas or are they more like guiding principles?
Well, there are actual formulas, yeah. I'm not a mathematician, so I certainly don't feel comfortable sort of explaining them. But we can actually measure these attributes of different options and put them into these models in order to sort of figure out, generally speaking, whether animals are expected to include them and how specialized they're expected to be.
Well, if I talk to like a physicist or a chemist, their formulas, there's usually not a lot of variance. They're measuring in some sense, a simpler system. Animals have a lot more noise in their behavior, I presume. Do the formulas, obviously they wouldn't still be around and be popular if they weren't a good fit, but how much explanatory power do they have?
The things that I'm really interested in are how they're not totally predictive in most cases. And I think one of the reasons is that we don't often account for the sort of cognitive processing that goes into play when animals are evaluating all of these different attributes of options. especially when they're evaluating multiple attributes or multiple options at the same time that vary along multiple attributes. I'm really interested in the sort of decision-making shortcuts that perform pretty well in most cases, but they don't necessarily align with predictions from these models perfectly.
So if we focus, I guess, on those payoffs, so animals are getting rewarded, but if I'm a forager, I go out and I do something. Do I have to sync with my peers on who accomplished more, or I guess does one forager arrive at its behavior?
I think that totally depends on the system. So if I'm thinking about this in bees, bumblebees in particular, other eusocial bees, honeybees, it absolutely does depend on your peers because we're thinking about this sort of maximization at the colony level rather than the individual level. We know that there's sort of division of labor where some bees are collecting nectar, others are collecting pollen. They're probably collecting variable types of both to balance the needs of the colony. But for most animals, this probably happens on an individual level where they're just trying to maximize their own energetic intake for the amount of time and sort of neural processing that goes into making these foraging decisions.
And is there a way to say the degree to which whether it's the whole colony or an individual, are they truly behaving optimally? Are they achieving, that sort of perfect balance of calories per minute time or whatever it is? Or, are they just getting kind of close to that?
I would be willing to bet across most systems that they're hitting pretty close to the mark, but not necessarily maximizing this currency in the most absolute way possible in every possible scenario.
And do you have any concern with coordination, or is it enough to just watch the foragers and see their individual behaviors?
What do you mean by coordination?
Well, maybe, a certain number might go out in a day. What direction are they going to go in? Bees probably have thousands of flowers to choose from. What if everybody picks the same one? That's not going to work out.
I also don't know how much I can speak to group level foraging, although that's something I'm sort of becoming interested in. I think it's probably balanced pretty well. So yeah, there's certainly thousands of different flowers that they could visit. We know that even like a single forager can visit hundreds to maybe thousands of flowers within a given day. They're probably attending to what's also being brought back into the nest. And so these things are probably dynamic over time where, if a lot of foragers are bringing back the same kind of nectar and it's mildly toxic or something like that, they might have mechanisms by which they could sort of diversify or send out more or less foragers accordingly. It feels like it's a really complex process to coordinate all of these things, but I'm sure they have mechanisms for doing so.
So natural selection certainly plays a role here, and I guess it does with all life. I don't particularly like the terms macro and micro selection because it implies they're like different things. But I guess my question I'm curious about is the degree to which natural selection plays a role in your research, or is it more of just a longer term effect?
A lot of what I study is, again, when do animals use certain decision rules, and particularly when do they have these really repeatable cognitive biases that influence their decisions, and how do those play out across different systems? One thing that I've studied quite a bit is this idea of economic rationality. So some animals, they don't evaluate options in sort of absolute terms, but instead the value placed on particular options varies depending on the context of the choice. And so they're evaluating options relative to the other options available within the choice set. And this leads to these sort of suboptimal decisions in certain choice contexts that potentially could leave them open to being exploited by the things that they're choosing between. But this is not necessarily a behavior that we see generally across a lot of different animals. And so just like incentive contrast, we see it across a lot of systems, but it's not present in other systems. And so it seems like these decision rules have been favored in certain systems by selection, potentially by, cutting down on decision-making time, and in certain environments where certain things are sort of autocorrelated and predictive over time. And so I'm really interested in exploring when and where we see these decision-making strategies playing out that have likely been favored by natural selection, and explaining why we see them in some systems and not others. So I found pretty robust results in my PhD that frog-eating bats are really rational in this context. And so at least when I was manipulating several key properties of frog calls that they're attending to, I couldn't shift their preferences in this way that's really easy to do if they're evaluating things comparatively rather than absolutely. In contrast, I found that Jamaican fruit bats, which are really close relatives to frog-eating bats and they live in the same forested environment, make really irrational decisions in this context. And so I think it has something to do with the things that they're actually eating. And obviously for fruit bats, they're sort of evolving in this mutualistic manner with the things that they're eating. Their food wants to be found by them. And so making a suboptimal decision still likely results in substantial energetic gain. Sorry about that. Whereas for frog-eating bats, their food is actively evading them. And so maybe making suboptimal decisions actually means a lost meal, and there's substantial reductions in energetic gain that can be associated with making suboptimal decisions and using decision rules in that context. And so I'm sort of interested in when and where we see these decision rules being favored by selection, and how we can predict them and broadly across a lot of different systems.
That's an interesting distinction. If my food is avoiding me, it's sort of a win-loss thing, versus if I pick the second best fruit, it's still a meal for me.
Exactly, yeah.
I guess, is that the main irrationality you see in the fruit bats, or are there other quote-unquote mistakes that they'll make?
That's the only project that I've done with them so far. In fact, there are certainly some people, especially in Europe and Israel, that are working with fruit bats and doing some cool stuff with their cognition. This is the only project that I've been able to do working with this system, and I have a lot of questions that I would like to continue to work on as I build up my lab and hopefully continue going down to Panama to do some work.
With regard to them making that suboptimal, I guess, fruit choice, how can you determine that it's suboptimal? Why couldn't it just be they woke up that morning and didn't feel like that particular fruit?
This is where you have to design the experiments very carefully to differentiate between these things. And certainly some proposed explanations for why we see these irrational decisions is that just they're changing in state across time, and so their preferences are changing with their state. And so in this experiment in particular, I was giving them the same, they had multiple different choice sets within the same night, and I did it in a randomized order. And basically what I found was they had these sort of set preferences between these two preferred food options if I was just giving them these two food options. But if I added this sort of irrelevant decoy option to a choice set, I could shift their preference towards one of those initially preferred food items. And so the fact that they're shifting and preferring something more in the presence of something that they're not selecting indicates that they're making a decision that's sensitive to the context of the choice, and it's not necessarily something they would prefer normally.
We've talked a little bit about the irrationality. Is there, and probably the scope is ongoing, there could be multiple forms of it, but are there any key ones you want to highlight? I think we talked about you could shift their choice in presence of the decoy. Are there other irrational behaviors you've uncovered?
Yeah, so the main two tenets of rational choice theory that are tested outside of humans, and that we have seen evidence for, I mean, you could argue that incentive contrast effects are also irrational because they're not making optimal decisions according to the objective payoffs of those options. But the other main tenet of rational choice theory that's commonly tested in animals, and there's been a lot of evidence for irrational decisions, is transitivity, which states that you should have a linear sort of ranking of options, and they should be non-circular. So if I prefer A to B and B to C and C to D, then if given a choice between A and D, I should prefer A. But what happens is usually if we think about things varying along multiple attributes, so for a bee that's foraging on a flower, the flower type might vary in terms of concentration and in terms of volume. And so A might be high in concentration but low in volume, and D might be high in volume but low in concentration. And so as things sort of move out in space along these two different attributes, we see these preference reversals when animals are confronting extreme options.
And let's say we're talking about the bees now. Let's say I'm a bee and I'm a forager and I find an especially good flower. I probably don't want to come back an hour later. It has to, produce more nectar or something along those lines. Is there a learning process that has to take place?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we know that so they have sort of decision rules that guide them through meadows so that they're not repeatedly visiting the same flowers. We also know that they can attend to cues on the flower themselves. So they attend to heat and electromagnetic properties of the flowers to give them some indication of how recently they've been visited by either themselves or another bee that's foraging in that meadow or another pollinator potentially. But they certainly have decision rules for how they move through meadows such that they don't constantly revisit the same flower types and spend that time probing at a flower that they've previously emptied.
And how has the field evolved in, let's say, the last 10 years? Are we making leaps and bounds discoveries, or is it all incremental?
I think a little bit of both,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the sort of subfield that I'm interested in. It feels like things are sort of developing incrementally, and there might be periods where there isn't a lot of work done, and then periods where there's high productivity and we're learning quite a bit quickly. It seems like on a whole, so all of this rationality and cognitive bias stuff has sort of come about within the last couple of decades. Mostly, I mean, certainly there's been stuff that preceded that was really foundational. But just in terms of thinking about pollinator cognition in general and how they're learning about different flowers and the mechanisms involved in learning both socially and asocially, the field has totally exploded, I think, in the last 20 to 30 years.
And what are some of the open questions, maybe in your lab in particular, but also broadly, that are being looked at?
As I mentioned earlier, I am starting to get really interested in group level decisions. And so a lot of what I've looked at in bees so far has really focused at the individual level. But I'm really interested in whether colonies as a whole exhibit certain cognitive biases, and if so, when, and what does that mean for the entire floral community? I did some work with bats previously, but there's been studies across a handful of different animals showing that if they learn about certain options when they're in lower energetic states, they preferentially choose those options even when they've gotten back to a satiated or better state later on. And so they have these sort of state dependent preferences that are guided by learning the state during learning previously. And I'm curious whether colonies exhibit this type of behavior. If colonies are learning about specific floral resources at states when they're just getting started in the spring and maybe the queen is still doing a lot of the foraging and their nutritional requirements are quite high and their energetic reserves are quite low, do we see some fidelity to those flower types later in the season, even after they've sort of caught up?
For the species you know best, will climate change impact these things?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just like most animals, they're certainly not immune to climate change and arguably probably a bit more sensitive than a lot of other animals. Obviously, with human-induced climate change, temperatures are rising quickly, and so bees are typically temperate animals that do really well in colder climates and at higher latitudes. And so foraging bees are starting to experience higher temperatures than they probably ever have before and for longer periods of time. And there's been some work that's come out recently that has shown they don't learn as well when they're foraging at really high temperatures. And so this obviously feels like it's really disruptive to their foraging behavior. Aside from that, there's clearly with the increase use of domesticated bees across most of North America and globally, there's the introduction of novel pathogens that are really detrimental to bumblebee colonies, and they can be spread on flowers. We're using pesticides at unprecedented rates, and those can have really important sublethal effects that influence bumblebee foraging and reproduction in pretty upsetting ways. Yeah, so a whole suite of, and then just changes in land use generally can be really disruptive and fragment environments and decrease potential nesting sites and foraging sites and things like that.
When you discuss rationality, and this is, I guess, my own bias, I immediately think of like econometrics and, prisoner's dilemma and that sort of thing is where I come from with rationality and my background in AI. Is fields like econometrics or maybe some others, where can influence come from or maybe inspiration come from in terms of other fields in your work?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, and I certainly enjoy reading some of that literature and thinking about how it applies to these different systems.
There's assumptions there too, though, right? Like most of econometrics assumes perfectly
Totally.
rational agents, which I think you've established you don't have.
Yeah, what is the name for him? Like Homo economicus or something?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like we're still using generally, in economics as well as in biology, we're using these models that predict these perfectly rational agents, which again are generally fairly predictive in most settings, but we know of these special circumstances where they just totally fail. And so it seems like there's a lot of opportunities to get inspiration from all of these things in the sort of economic realm and think about how they play out in biological systems.
I guess I also wanted to ask you a little bit about where your research is going next. We've touched on a few things, but what are some of the things you're most excited about?
Trying to get my lab up and running at this point. I definitely have a lot of outstanding questions. With the bee system, I actually have some questions that are generally applicable across both of the systems. I'm working on a proposal right now with one of the colleagues here where we're really interested in this idea of choice overload. In humans, in the economic literature, there's a lot of really sort of robust findings that when humans are confronted with too many options at the same time, they're more likely to suffer these sort of decision-making consequences. So they'll forego making a choice, they'll take longer to make a choice, they're less satisfied with the thing that they've chosen, and it can have all of these sort of negative detriments. And so marketers are really clever about manipulating choice context for people such that they're not sort of overloaded in this manner. And so we're really interested in across systems, whether there are similar sort of principles in terms of how animals confront multiple options and whether their performance always increases with more options or, at which point it sort of decreases. And in those cases, how that then selects for the things that they're making decisions about. You can think about this in frogs that are lekking and they aggregate to call for females. When we think about mate choice preferences, we usually measure them in these really simplified scenarios where we give a female two choices between two different males that vary in this single attribute. But in reality, females are choosing between this sometimes thousands of calling males that various aspects of their signaling properties. And so at what point does that preference sort of fall apart and the choice sort of is made at random or just not made?
We touched a little bit earlier on doing things in a lab versus the wild. To what degree does captivity alter or change the behaviors?
It seems like it varies quite a bit from system to system, and certainly this is something that everybody should be taking into consideration when they're doing captive experiments. For some animals, it's sort of a presence-absence thing. Once we place them in captivity, they no longer exhibit the natural behaviors that we're trying to measure. Some frog species, for instance, if you bring them into the lab and try and rear them, they just won't call under those conditions. For the bat work that I've done, it's certainly something that I've been cognizant of trying to control for and reduce in every way possible, but they are very social animals. For the frog-eating bats, that meant that, we would have to, we obviously had to do behavioral experiments where they were housed in isolation, but we would try and do these on timescales where they weren't getting stressed out by those conditions. That wasn't influencing their behavior, although it certainly could have been in some way that we weren't aware of. For the fruit bat work, we would actually bring them in cohorts and we would house them in groups to reduce that social stress of being housed in isolation. And then we would do all of our experiments with them. We would just pull them one at a time to do experiments with them and then return them to their social group at the end of the night.
Well, if I understood correctly, one of the findings was that the frog-eating bats, would go for larger choruses. So presumably a little pond or nest or whatever it is where they heard more voices, which seems very logical to me. More voices, probably more meal options.
Yeah.
What would be the reason to deviate from that? That one seems like an obvious good choice to me.
Yeah. So what I found is that their preference sort of drops off and maybe even peaks around 3 to 4 individuals. So we know they're sort of perch hunters. They'll go to an area where there are a lot of calling frogs from their roost, and they'll stay there for an hour or two while they hopefully catch as many frogs as they can over the course of that foraging period, and they'll do that maybe multiple times a night. But these bats can easily eat several frogs at a time. And so, it seems like they should go to choruses that have more calling males at a single time. But getting back into this cognitive aspect of things, we know that actually identifying a single individual in a chorus of calling individuals becomes an increasingly more, difficult task as that chorus size gets larger and larger. And so it seems like potentially they're targeting choruses that have enough calling individuals that could feed them for some period of time, but maybe not too many, that their capture success of a single male would start to decrease with more calling males.
How do you know how many are calling? Are there microphones involved, or what's the experimental setup?
Yeah, so this was an experiment that I did in the lab, and I actually generated these choruses artificially. I created them using these pre-recorded frog calls, and I combined them such that the calls were not so overlapping that it just sounded like one really loud call at a time, so they were distinguishable from one another. And I gave them choices, so 1 frog or 2, 3 frogs or 4, and every sort of pairwise combination, I think up to 6 frogs in that experiment.
So we definitely identified some statistically significant behaviors. Is it so significant that you could confidently direct the bat if that had been your objective?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think it would be interesting to first measure whether, if we played choruses in the wild, those were actually getting attacked more than, other choruses that were either larger or smaller at the sort of upper ends of where we think they might be attending. I think there's probably just so many other things that are factored into the decision-making process as they're foraging in the wild. Like I said, they're eating multiple different frog species, and so maybe a little unwieldy. Also, they're foraging over these really large spatial scales, and so even getting them to the right location that you could manipulate their choices that easily would be difficult. That being said, people in the lab that I worked in for my PhD have done these really cool experiments where they train them to these totally artificial stimuli. So this one woman trained frog-eating bats to fly to heavy metal, and they learned if they flew to this stimulus in the lab, they would repeatedly get food. And so she actually did take this out into the wild and played it and got some bats coming back in. If it's totally novel and it's played loud enough, I'm sure you could do that. But just in terms of exploiting their preferences based on natural stimuli, I think it might be a little bit difficult in the wild. But maybe something that frogs are able to do. It certainly feels like selection's operating on this aspect of their calling behavior potentially.
A couple times you've mentioned setting up a lab. Could you share a few details on what that all involves?
Yeah, so bumblebees are really great to work with in the lab for quite a few reasons. They just require a lot less care than bats, but a lot of other animals. I can work with them in pretty small spaces. So I can actually order some colonies and have them delivered to the lab. And they just live in these small little nest boxes, which I can connect to a little foraging arena. And I can let all of the bees out at the same time, or I can let them out one at a time and give them an array at the end that has variable flower types, where I can look at how well they learn about those different flower types and measure their preferences based on those flowers. And just in terms of setting up the lab, it's been a learning process. I just started last fall. Hopefully I'm going to have a grad student and a postdoc that are joining me in the lab in the fall, in this upcoming fall, and build up the people that are doing these exciting projects.
And what's the day-to-day going to be like for that grad student and postdoc?
The postdoc hopefully will just jump right in and focus on doing experiments. And we have a couple of experiments already lined up that they're interested in doing. So just a lot of data collection on the front end, and then hopefully analyzing and writing some manuscripts as they are generating these data sets. I think the grad student probably will be taking classes and will be developing ideas, especially in the early end of the process. And so there might be a lot of sort of early project ideas that get piloted and totally fail, but that's the fun part of the process, I would say.
Well, I wonder if there could be video involved in some of this, certainly a spreadsheet of something. What's your data collection and what kind of data do you wind up with?
Definitely lots of videos, hard drives full of videos. So we record all of our behavioral trials and training trials, but a lot of what we're actually measuring is the floral preferences that they're, the choices that they're making, right? And so if we're giving them a choice between blue and yellow flowers, and we know, the blue flowers have higher sucrose concentration, but they're less rewarding on average in terms of their rate, versus yellow flowers that are lower in sucrose concentration, but constantly rewarding. We can just basically ask how many times are they going to one versus the other. We can ask how many times are they switching between the two, whether they start by foraging on one and then shift to the other over the course of multiple trials. Another metric that I haven't yet measured, but I think is really interesting to a lot of these questions, is how much time does it take them to make a decision? So once they leave the colony and actually enter this foraging arena and they're looking at these different flowers, how long are they evaluating these different flower types and considering the options that they have available to them before they make their first choice?
And I know we can't truly know, but it seems like the longer they wait, the more they're thinking.
It seems like they should be, but I hopefully will be able to draw some relationship between those two things. Do we see more evidence for sort of better decision-making outcomes for bees that take longer? And certainly there have been a few studies that have come out showing that they do have sort of speed accuracy trade-offs. And so the faster bees tend to be a little less accurate on average than the slower bees. And it's pretty consistent across individuals.
What's next for your work?
Well, the biggest thing I think I'm excited about, it's been a few years since I've been able to go to Panama and do work on bats. I'm really hoping to be able to get down in the next year or two and get back to doing some experiments, especially like I mentioned with the fruit bats. So I think that's big on my list. Getting the lab set up, getting people in the lab that are doing projects on bumblebees, I feel like is exciting and on the horizon. And then I'm in East Tennessee now, which is really close to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park and one of the highest areas in terms of floral diversity and quite a few different bumblebee species here. And so it feels like a great opportunity to take some of the questions that we're asking in the lab and apply them in a field setting and ask whether bees are doing the same thing in natural settings.
And is there anywhere listeners could follow you online?
I'm not very active on Twitter, but I have a Twitter profile. I'll probably be developing an Instagram page for my lab in the next few months. So I'll be posting lots of pictures of bees and bats for those who are interested. I have a website with my email address and contact information if anybody's interested in getting in touch.
Very cool. We'll have links in the show notes for people to follow up. And let me know later about that Instagram. That might actually get me to sign up. That sounds great.
Okay.
Well, Claire, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.